Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking a look at another display in our favourite category, 1440p gaming monitors. It's the Nixeus NX-EDG27X, and it provides a 27-inch 1440p 165Hz IPS panel from AU Optronics at a price tag of just $400. This sort of panel and display should be an alternative to the popular models that use LG panels, such as the LG 27GP83B, but without the major downside of a poor contrast ratio. However, there's also a ton of competition in this space right now, with highly attractive buys including the Gigabyte M27Q, Dell S2721DGF, and MSI MAG274 QRF-QD, all vying for a piece of that mid-range pie. So Nixeus will have to be offering something pretty compelling to get my recommendation, and we'll explore that throughout today's video. One of the major criticisms that I've had of Nixeus monitors in the past is the build quality. The 4K model I reviewed midway through last year was cheap and crappy in its use of plastic, despite costing a full $800. Luckily, with the new NX-EDG27X, that appears to be addressed to some degree, now including a design more typical of today's mid-range monitors. The bezels are the most noticeable change. Nixeus have swapped chunky and terrible looking bezels for a relatively slim plastic frame, which better suits the panel being used here. However, the bezels aren't as slim as Nixeus's misleading marketing, which shows edge-to-edge bezels when in reality there is still a bit of bezel around all the sides. The design and build used here is nothing overly special, but the mostly plastic construction feels more tightly put together than past attempts. The rear of the monitor is a little busy for my liking, however I do appreciate the use of an ergonomic stand, which includes a decent range of height adjustability, plus swivel and pivot support. In terms of inputs, we get DisplayPort 1.2 and two HDMI 2.0 ports. For the full 165Hz, you'll need to use DisplayPort, as these HDMI ports only support up to 144Hz. Adaptive Sync is included here through FreeSync Premium certification, although it also works just fine with NVIDIA GPUs. There's also an audio output jack and fairly mediocre built-in speakers. My biggest annoyance with the design is Nixeus's refusal to use a directional toggle for navigating the OSD, which is now standard among these sorts of gaming monitors. The 4 buttons on the back of the monitor are hard to use, especially so because there's no labeling of what the buttons actually do. I've used a lot of monitors over the years, and this is definitely one of the more difficult ones in terms of OSD navigation. It's made worse by how basic the OSD itself actually is. There's a few color controls in here and most of the usual brightness and contrast settings, but it lacks any of the gaming specific features we've seen recently from other monitors, like crosshairs or even backlight strobing. There is an overdrive slider that allows you to pick from any setting between 0 and 100 for precise control, but that's really the only standout. Speaking of overdrive, let's dive into performance. As there's so many different possible overdrive modes, I'm going to skip straight into talking about the best settings to use. At 165Hz, I found a setting around 45 to be optimal for gaming, and by that I mean 45 offered the lowest cumulative deviation value of the settings I tried. Cumulative deviation measures the bounce between speed and overshoot, so the lowest value tells us the best bounce between those things has been achieved. Using this setting, there is a small amount of overshoot, but it's generally negligible and hard to notice during gameplay, while performance around the 5.4 millisecond mark is decent. On their website, Nixeus advertises variable overdrive as a feature of this monitor. However, during testing, I didn't see evidence of this feature being active, and I tried a wide variety of settings, including Nixeus's recommended settings they provided in an email. The basics are that while an overdrive setting of 45 is great for 165Hz gaming, performance quickly degrades at lower refresh rates using the same overdrive setting, to the point where at 100Hz, and especially at even lower refreshes, there is quite a large amount of overshoot. Normally, a variable overdrive implementation would look to minimize increases in overshoot at lower refresh rates. That's kind of the whole point of variable overdrive. But the NX-EDG27X, when set to overdrive 45, increases from an average error of 7.4% at 165Hz to 16.7% at 60Hz, which hurts performance. It's disappointing to see variable overdrive not really being a feature here. It's either not actually included, or it is included but is running at such a low level that it's ineffective. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that performance is terrible, as the overdrive settings do allow for fine control. When testing across the refresh range, I found a setting of approximately 30 to be the best for gaming at all refresh rates. At 165Hz, performance is marginally worse than using Overdrive 45, with response times now at 6.2 milliseconds. But with such low levels of overshoot, cumulative deviation is hardly affected, so in practice it's quite difficult to notice any difference between these modes. What using Overdrive 30 does is that it minimizes overshoot at lower refresh rates. When we get to 85Hz, overshoot has increased to the point where inverse ghosting is present for 26% of all transitions tested, but this is still usable and cumulative deviation of 621 is manageable. At 60Hz, performance is a lot better than at Overdrive 45, and yeah, overshoot is still visible to a degree, but there's no better choice as again, variable overdrive isn't really present. If you want to minimize that overshoot, you can reduce the overdrive setting to about 23, though this comes at a cost of response times at higher refresh rates. What we're left with is a borderline single overdrive mode experience. I think Overdrive 30 is fine for most gaming, but it could have been tidied up to a great experience if variable overdrive was working as it should. At the same time, I don't think it's worth messing around with the overdrive fine-tuning at different refresh rates, though you may want to adjust the setting up or down, depending on whether you'll be primarily playing at higher or lower refresh rates. At the maximum 165Hz refresh rate, the NX-EDG27X performs decently well, delivering response times around the level of the S2721DGF and other popular mid-range 1440p gaming monitors. The level of overshoot is higher than its competitors, but not to the degree where performance is ruined, so overall, you can expect a pretty similar experience whether you buy this display or others in the chart, especially as many come with a 165Hz refresh rate. It's also a clear step up over last generation mid to entry level alternatives such as the Pixio PX277 Prime, which is now quite hard to recommend. On average across the refresh range, the NX-EDG27X retains its mid-table positioning, so once again it's reasonably competitive with other displays. In particular, you can see performance that's only 10% behind that of the Dell S2721DGF, which is basically negligible when talking display response times. However, it's also not in a leading position. For example, the 27GP83B is a step ahead in performance, and the MAG274QRF-QD offers similar response times, but at a lower level of overshoot. What we've just been talking about is illustrated well in the cumulative deviation results. For modern IPS panels, we typically want to see a result between 500 and 600, which indicates it's using the latest level of the technology. This Nixeus monitor meets this requirement, and overall it is similar to other mid-range monitors that we've tested, so nothing out of the ordinary to report here. It seems that this AU Optronics panel indeed provides response time similar to that of LG's Nano IPS panels. At 120Hz, the story doesn't change substantially. We're still looking at mid-range response times similar to that of other IPS monitors that I've tested. At 60Hz, performance is a bit better than average as we can really dial in the performance due to the granular overdrive controls. However, this doesn't allow it to substantially outperform any other similar monitors. So while adjustable overdrive is a nice to have feature, it's also dependent on the panel itself delivering the best available performance. Input lag is very low. In fact, the simplistic feature set seems to allow a near zero amount of processing delay. This leaves the NX-EDG27X as a mid-table option, with the majority of the lag coming from the refresh rate of 165Hz. If you want improved latency, you'll need to step up to a 240Hz display, although those are much more expensive. Power consumption is the lowest we've seen for this type of 27-inch monitor, although we're only talking about a difference of 1 to 2 watts, so it is quite negligible. Nevertheless, we don't want to see panels waste power unnecessarily, and that's not the case here. Now time for color performance, and we'll start with color space. This panel is being advertised as sort of an LG Nano IPS equivalent with 98% DCI-P3 coverage. However, in our testing it falls a bit short of that level at 95% coverage. That's still very strong for color accurate work in that color space. However, Rec 2020 coverage is not that different from other mid-tier monitors at 75%, as it lacks full coverage of Adobe RGB. In contrast, the MAG274QRF-QD pushes color gamut up to 83%, which allows for great results in Adobe RGB. Factory calibration was poor. My unit came with a strong cold/blue tint out of the box, and gamma results were too high. This led to terrible Delta E performance, including a Delta E2000 average above 6.0, which is simply not accurate. On top of this, there is no sRGB gamut clamp enabled by default, so colors are oversaturated in addition to being tinted blue. This led to below average results in our saturation and color checker tests. Compared to other monitors, you can see these weak grayscale results playing out in the chart, with most other monitors delivering a much more accurate experience from the factory. Color checker results are much more mid-tier, as many other mid-range gaming monitors also don't come with a gamut clamp enabled by default. However, one of the major downsides to this Nixeus monitor is the lack of an sRGB mode. This means it's impossible to achieve significantly better results in saturation tests using the OSD controls alone. I was able to improve the white balance of the display, which led to a large improvement in grayscale results, but wide gamut monitors really should include sRGB modes for the best performance in everyday content like YouTube videos and web browsing. A full calibration using Portrait Display's CalMan software can deliver accurate results for sRGB and P3. However, as we're relying on an ICC profile to do the bulk of the work here, this level of calibration is limited to apps that support proper color management. It would have been nice to see more control offered to buyers in the OSD, as hardware calibration is always the best approach. No complaints about maximum brightness. It hits over 400 nits after calibration, and that's in line with other monitors of this type. Minimum brightness is okay, but not spectacular by any means. One of the best areas to performance is the contrast ratio. A result of 1306:1 is high for an IPS monitor and clearly superior to LG's Nano IPS panels. The S2721DGF, for example, reported in with a poor 857:1 result, making this Nixeus monitor over 50% better in contrast, which is quite a noticeable change. This gives the NX-EDG27X a big edge considering response time performance between those two types of panels is similar. However, the benefit compared to a monitor like the MSI Optics one in this chart is much smaller, and while the Nixeus model is still strong, a 22% lead may not be enough to offset other issues, and overall contrast is still bad compared to other display technologies like VA LCD. Viewing angles are a non-issue, like most IPS monitors. Uniformity with my unit was acceptable, but a fairly average result overall, nothing too bad, nothing too great either. There was a bit of a fall off along the left edge in particular. Overall, the Nixeus NX-EDG27X ends up as a fairly typical entry-level to mid-range 1440p medium refresh rate gaming monitor. There's nothing really that stands out about this display. There's some areas of good performance, some areas of poor performance, but generally it's just fine. I'm glad to see Nixeus using a current generation AU Optronics panel that delivers decent response time performance, rather than falling into the trap of, say, a Razer Raptor 27 and using something last generation that's clearly inferior. I wouldn't say gaming performance is a big standout here, and the lack of noticeable variable overdrive is disappointing considering it's advertised, but there's no glaring issues here either, so the overall experience is perfectly acceptable for this class of monitor. I was also pleased to see that despite using a similar type of IPS technology to the collection of LG Nano IPS panels, the NX-EDG27X doesn't suffer from a low contrast ratio. In that sense, this monitor is very similar to something like a Dell S2721DGF, but without that Dell monitor's main limitation. With a respectable wide gamut and decent brightness, it can be a good-looking display. However, I did find a few pretty big negatives. Factory calibration is poor and there's no sRGB mode, so it takes a bit of work to get this monitor into an accurate state. Nixeus needed to pay more attention to this area, especially as they're using a wide gamut panel. The OSD setup is also very bad, the control scheme is difficult to navigate, and the feature set is weak in comparison to many of today's gaming monitors in this price range. But hey, at least Nixeus stepped up their build quality compared to the last monitor of theirs that I looked at. So like I said, this is a pretty average, fine gaming monitor that would be an okay choice at the right price. Unfortunately, this is where the biggest downside plays a factor. Nixeus have significantly overpriced this display. At $400 US, it's basically impossible to recommend. The MSI MAG274 QRF-QD is currently available for just $370 US, and it's a better monitor in every way. It's slightly faster, it's better calibrated, has a wider color gamut, and since a firmware update now has a working sRGB mode. It also includes a better OSD experience. But even if the MSI model was out of stock, there's also the issue of the Dell S2721DGF, LG 27GP83B, and Gigabyte M27Q, all of which I mentioned in my recent Best of Monitors video. All three of these displays are available for $350 or less, and are either similar to this Nixeus option or better. With that in mind, I think the NX-EDG27X is at least $70 too expensive. Around $330 would be a fair price, and it is where I could start to recommend it, but at $400, No thanks. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you're interested in seeing our recommendations for monitors at the moment, we do have a full guide up on the channel at the moment, so that's well worth checking out if this Nixeus monitor did disappoint you a little bit. As always, we also appreciate anyone that wants to support our independent monitor testing. We have our Patreon and Floatplane accounts. Links to those are in the description below. You can ask me questions through our Discord chat as one of the perks. We've also got behind the scenes videos, monthly live streams, all that good stuff. So thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.